Hey everyone, welcome to another exciting movie review. Today's review is about the 2018 science fiction thriller Hotel Artemis. I thought that this was a captivating and creative film. It was really intriguing, and most of it kept me on the edge of my seat, so to speak. I didn't know what was going to happen next. The story was light on its toes and pretty unpredictable. Now, while Hotel Artemis is a really good movie, and I really enjoyed it, it's not without its flaws. The setting is a near-future cyberpunk dystopia in the grimy, dangerous Los Angeles of 2028, which is overrun with crime and violence. And America, it seems, has descended into a corporate dystopia, where corporate influence has penetrated everywhere, deeply into our healthcare. This is like a future where our healthcare system just gets worse and doesn't get better. If that happened, this movie would become reality. So the film begins with a massive riot opening up in LA after water becomes privatized, and the unwashed masses can no longer afford it. 4 characters, 2 of them brothers, decide to take advantage of the chaos of the riot and rob a bank. But they're not really that competent, and they can't get into the vault, so they decide to steal all the money and the jewelry and stuff from the hostages. They figure that in the riot, all of the rich people would be bunkering up in their houses and they'd send their servants to go drop off their valuables for safekeeping. One of these dudes in the bank, one of these servants, one of these hostages, happens to be in the employ of a powerful underground crime lord called the Wolf King. He's carrying valuable jewels worth tens of millions of dollars, and when one of the brothers in the rob squad takes it out of his pocket, the guy warns him against it. This was a pretty fun scene, and I liked the ominous nature of the guy's warning, although, as we'll see, this turned out to be more bark than bite. The Wolf King is known to drown anyone who steals from him, so the bank robbers are essentially marked men. They leave the bank, but they soon run into some armored militarized police, and there's a brief shootout where some cops are killed, one of the robbers is killed, and 2 of the robbers, including one of the brothers, the brother who stole the pen, are grievously wounded. One guy is grazed in the neck, but somehow doesn't bleed out. He says he's got a bullet in his neck, and who knows if that's just hysteria or confusion, or if he really does have a bullet in his neck, but my immediate guess would be that unless it was just a grazing wound, any bullet shot to the neck would leave you either paralyzed or bleeding out in minutes. This ends up being a meaningless detail. I'm just nitpicking here because this guy ends up dying pretty soon anyway. The 2 brothers and this third guy make it to a place called Hotel Artemis, which is apparently like a quasi-military hospital embedded in the 12th floor of a tall apartment building. It's known to treat wounded criminals who pay their monthly subscription fees, protecting their privacy with code names, and getting them back out onto the streets alive with no questions asked. But if the violence of the riot and the violence of the police response tells us anything about LA in this future 2028, it's that it's a stupidly dangerous place. It's basically a war zone, especially outside on the streets. It looks a lot like Syria during the height of its civil war. This subscription-based hospital idea is also a pretty cool concept in cyberpunk science fiction, and I think it's pretty well done in this movie. It's extra creepy because the brutally capitalist nature of this healthcare system is a very realistic permutation of the current American healthcare system. This mercantile treatment of human life is an undercurrent throughout the whole movie, getting expressed in the characters' behavior and interactions. So the 2 brothers in the rob squad are paying members of Hotel Artemis, so they're let in. But the third guy with that bullet wound to his neck isn't. He hasn't paid his subscription fees, and he's not allowed in, so he goes and dies off-screen in the riots, or from bleeding to death. Hotel Artemis is shown to have a single nurse, Jean the Nurse Thomas, played by Jodie Foster, and she's assisted by her mountainous bodyguard and assistant healthcare provider, Everest, played by Dave Bautista. As the plot unfolds, it involves a very healthy amount of character intrigue, and some rather interesting character development. There's a slew of characters that get introduced into the hotel, and it sets a really interesting tone where you're guessing at their backgrounds and their backstories and how they all relate to each other. The brothers have their own drama, where one is revealed to have a heroin addiction and this ends in tragedy, and the surviving brother, codenamed Waikiki and played by Sterling Brown, is revealed to have some kind of romantic history with another patient at the hotel, a character who is presented at first as a prostitute, but is then revealed to be a highly skilled, expensive assassin, played by Sofia Boutella. Her codename at the hotel is Nice, after the French city. And it's kind of interesting, because this brother drama seems pretty good-natured and innocent, even though they were introduced robbing a bank. And so you kind of wonder what that history is between the surviving brother and this assassin lady. It's pretty interesting, raises some questions. But I'll get to more on this later. Now, another patient is an arms dealer, codenamed Acapulco, and played by Charlie Day. The viewer is led to think that this guy, because he's a huge asshole who does some pretty shady shit with his arms dealing, he's probably the target of her assassination. But he's revealed to be not the big bad guy, but just an egotistical prick who thinks he's a big tough guy hotshot because he sells weapons and has a few $1,000,000 in his wallet. The brother and the assassin learn that the pen, stolen from the Wolf King's servant during the bank heist, is actually a mobile safe, and that they're doomed now that they've stolen from the Wolf King. As the characters are resting in the hotel, two things happen in short order that throw them all in danger. First, there's a wounded police officer who's seen on a security cam begging the nurse for help. Now this is a problem, because Hotel Artemis doesn't treat cops, because that would compromise them in the eyes of their regular criminal customers, and then their business would crash. But the nurse knows this particular cop from earlier in her life, before she was a nurse at Hotel Artemis, and before her son died. It suggested that Nurse Thomas's son, Beau, died of a heroin overdose, and that his body was possibly found on the beach, discarded under a dock like garbage. The police officer, named Morgan, or Momo, and played by Jenny Slate, was friends with Beau as a child, having been neighbors with the nurse, who Morgan calls Mrs. Thomas. So there's more backstory and more character intrigue that's going on here as well. And when the nurse goes to rescue her cop, despite Everest advising against this, you see that she suffers from extreme agoraphobia, and probably some degree of social anxiety, almost certainly as a consequence of living in Hotel Artemis for 22 years with a veritable war zone outside. Okay, so that happens, but the nurse also learns that the Wolf King himself is injured and is coming to the hotel, expecting service despite the limited number of rooms and the strict rules of Hotel Artemis. As the nurse treats the Wolf King, and he's under light anesthetic, he mentions Beau's name, without the nurse ever having told him Beau's name. The nurse then suspects that her son was murdered, and further drugs the Wolf King to make him tell the truth. He confirms that Beau was murdered, drowned under a dock because he stole the Wolf King's Porsche. The nurse is furious and moves to kill him, but she gets distracted when the generator is sabotaged and patients start coding. The movie begins to wrap up with a violent, blood-soaked ending. The Wolf King's youngest son and his crew of henchmen try to break into the hospital to save his father, but soon learn that he was killed by the assassin. There's a particularly grimy detail thrown in here, where it's mentioned that the assassin has a video feed built into her contact lens, so that her employer can watch the assassination and masturbate to it later. I mean, that's some dark, white-collar, underground, organized crime creeper shit, and it adds greatly to the dark, twisted tone of the film. Anyways, Acapulco meets a grisly demise. Waikiki eventually escapes the hotel and seeks help elsewhere, and Everest and Nice fight the henchmen in the Wolf King's entourage. At first, it's implied that Everest and Nice are killed, as the fights are pretty realistic. And even though the protagonists are strong and good at fighting, they're not superheroes, and they're shown to be vulnerable and in serious danger. They get hit a couple times and it does some damage. But there's a scene at the very end of the movie that shows that Everest for sure survived, and there's a mid-credit scene that implies that Nice also survived. The movie ends with the nurse hobbling through the smoke and rubble to get back to Hotel Artemis, to keep treating people and saving the lives of her customers. Despite the dark, dystopian tone of the movie, I thought it had a relatively happy ending, especially when compared to some of my other favorite movies, like The Grey and Children of Men. The nurse almost casually returning to work made me think that these wild, death-defying events of the movie weren't all that abnormal for Hotel Artemis. I mean, the Wolf King was a pretty big customer, and his death presumably has larger political repercussions, but the nurse herself and Everest seemed to be content going right back to work as healthcare providers, as if the violence and death was itself not really anything out of the ordinary. That says a lot about the state of Los Angeles in 2028, and it says a lot more about the nature of American healthcare. I think this movie did a really good job of building up character intrigue, but a lot of these threads that are revealed, these interactions between the characters and these past histories, they never really ended up going anywhere, despite a series of dramatic fights and betrayals. The movie built up a lot of depth, but it felt like it wasn't ever really fully explored. There wasn't a satisfying release for all of this buildup. The end result is a great context and a great setting with depth and nuance and stinging social commentary, but the weight behind many of these scenes dissolves as the plot of the movie seems to turn in a new direction every couple of minutes and leaves behind some of the old threads. Now, the Wikipedia article on the movie presents the quotes of two critics, one who I really agree with, and one who I really don't. Mick LaSalle, writing for the San Francisco Chronicle, gives credit to the director for this being his first movie, and says that it did a good job balancing, quote, absurdity, but also the consequences, unquote. He also commended the film for its, quote, genuine thrills, terrific cast, and strong performances, unquote. I agree with this pretty much entirely. This is a super efficient way to describe Hotel Artemis, because I was genuinely thrilled. The cast was really strong, and they all provided really good performances. I mean, each individual actor's contribution was excellent. Now, the other critic is Richard Roper, who writes for the Chicago Sun-Times. He criticized the movie, saying that it was, quote, all too predictable and familiar, unquote. Let's just say that I disagree with this to the point that I think that Mr. Roper's criticism is kind of pretentious and flimsy. The film has its flaws, for sure, but it was hardly predictable. It was a fresh story with a great setting fertile for storytelling, and as I was watching Hotel Artemis, I was pretty excited because most of the time I really couldn't tell what was going to happen next. As for biology, I'm going to give Hotel Artemis a near-perfect 9.5 out of 10. The depiction of biology was pretty spot on, although admittedly it was very limited. It was limited to the depiction of trauma medicine. One of the reasons I want to give it a high score here is because the elephant tranquilizer was a pretty neat Chekhov's gun, but the reason I'm not giving it a perfect score is because, let's just say that I'm a little skeptical of someone's ability to run around and scream and shout and plead for their life as they're complaining about a bullet lodged in their neck. That seems more like movie physics where people can get shot and then, stand up and shake it off and be fine a few minutes later. Seems a little exaggerated, but it's ultimately a tiny little nitpick. As for the plot, I give Hotel Artemis 7.5 out of 10. Which might seem like a low score for a movie that I generally really enjoyed and talked positively about. But I felt like I had to dock a point because I was kind of frustrated at the characters' storylines that fizzled out. And I had to dock another point because the ending wasn't as satisfying as I felt it could have been. I liked the movie, and I liked the ending, but the meta-narrative could have been, and really should have been, more cohesive and explored in greater detail. But for Drew Pearce's directorial debut, it wasn't bad at all. If you're at all interested in cyberpunk science fiction and dark dystopian stories, then you'll really like Hotel Artemis.